Assalamu alaikum. My name is Kamilah. I am politics editor for Sapelo Square, and joining me today is Saleemah Abdul-Ghafur, who is chairman of the board for the Georgia Muslim Voter Project. Thank you for joining me.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. It's my pleasure.
Welcome, welcome. So we have like a day left before these 2018 midterm elections are in the bag. I think everyone will be looking forward to that deep breath of having it done. And depending on the outcome, we'll probably maybe need to take some more breaths to deal with what comes next. And so I thought it was important for us to have this conversation to kind of talk about Black Muslims and our role in this election.
Absolutely.
And the politics of civic engagement and self-determination, and what we have to offer, and how we should be moving through this process. So if you could start by telling me a bit about the Georgia Muslim Voter Project and, how and why you got involved, and if there are other organizations like this in other parts of the country.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Kamilah. I really admire the work that Sapelo Square is doing. It's important work, it's rigorous work, and it's work that needs to continue and to evolve, and we need to support it. So I was thrilled to get the invitation, but also wanted you to know that I'm also a supporter and tremendous fan of the work that you and Suad and all the others are doing. So the Georgia Muslim Voter Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit civic engagement organization, and our mission and vision is to engage Muslims in Georgia in local elections, statewide elections, and all of the civic engagement activities at the local level that help, quite frankly, to improve the quality of life. So school board elections, local law enforcement, volunteering, everything to do that makes your local environment better. We want to engage our Georgia Muslims in. Our mandate is in Metro Atlanta, and then earlier this year, we decided to expand to the entire state of Georgia. Okay. We work in partnership. We're a standalone 501c3, but we work in partnership with other organizations that are doing civic engagement work in Georgia, but also nationally. So we have local and national funders, and we have a host of local and national partners because, civic engagement work is definitely collaboration work. And Georgia Muslims are many, right? There's many professions within them. There's many ages. There's many ethnic groups, et cetera. So we do work nationally with other organizations that are working on this. In March of 2018, we convened 35 community organizers from 22 states who are working specifically with the Muslim community to do some training around data collection in the Muslim for voter registration activities, but also to make sure that they knew about each other and were in collaboration with each other and could support each other in the run-up to this election cycle. We were founded in 2015 by Aisha Yaqub, who is an extraordinary young Muslim woman here in Georgia, and she resigned earlier this year to run for office.
That's right. So why did you get involved?
So my story is that I work on public health in sub-Saharan Africa in my day job, which takes up a lot of time and energy. And most of my focus is overseas, although I live here in Atlanta and love living here in Atlanta. And after the November 2016 presidential election, I woke up the day after the election and then went back to bed, depressed and angry and really upset. And my mother, Umi, sent me, so I call my mother Umi, which some African-American Muslims call their moms Umi. So, for those of you who are watching who don't know.
Umi knows.
So Umi knows, she knows. My Umi said on the day after the election, she sent a text to the whole family acknowledging the pain that we were in, but also saying that we have been through worse.
Mm.
that we had been through worse and that our ancestors had been through way worse, and we would survive this and we would thrive throughout this time, and that now was the time for us to go local, to work in our local communities. And so I prayed, honestly, I prayed to Allah and I asked him, how do I best use my time, my talents, my resources to serve locally? And that was around the time that Aisha asked me to join her board.
Okay.
And that was really the beginning. About, I don't know, a few months later at a retreat, I was elected board chair. And a few months after that, Aisha resigned to run for office. So it's been quite a hectic time, but it's been extraordinary. It's a very active board. It's a very supportive and knowledgeable board. We've registered hundreds of people in this state, been a resource for people in this state. And we just, we'll talk about this later, but we just became the plaintiff in a case to address the voter suppression that is happening here in Georgia. So,
and you won.
And we won, and the Secretary of State appealed, and we won on appeal.
Won again, yes.
It makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what has interested me in this cycle, but in previous cycles, is seeing the increased engagement, the civic engagement in the broader American and Muslim community over the last 20 years or so. But that dynamic has always been a little bit different in Black Muslim communities. And for me, having spent time away from Atlanta and then moving back and seeing my community so engaged and really pushing people to vote, that was not the wave when I was younger. And so, I wanted to know if you agree and if you had any idea about why that might have changed, and what have you noticed about Black Muslim specifically engagement during this election cycle, and maybe previous election cycles?
Definitely. Well, certainly I agree with you that voting has not always been a done deal. The idea that someone in the Muslim community or a Black Muslim would vote was not automatic. My experience anecdotally has been that in the American Muslim community, African American Muslims, who make up the largest number, single ethnic group within the American Muslim community, have been more likely to vote than some of our other Muslims from the Asian and Arab and other traditions. Okay. And part of that has been because we're African Americans, and voting is a legacy for us. Our ancestors gave their blood, their sweat, and their tears. So some people, it's just grandfathered in. Like, you're not going to not vote because it's disrespectful to your ancestors. It's disrespectful to your legacy when this vote is something that we fought for, we died for, we bled for. To not vote would be disrespectful to that. But I also think that the American Muslim community is evolving and developing. And I think that many of our Muslims were afraid to vote because they thought it would bring increased scrutiny. They were apathetic, didn't think it would make a difference. And I have seen in the last 20 years, there's more and more institutional development around voter registration in American Muslim communities. And there's more and more people talking about it in their houses and in their mosques. Now, in the last 2 years, all of the data, the Institute for Social and Public Understanding, ISPU, which is the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, has been collecting data for several years. And on Muslim trends, Muslim attitudes in this area, I recommend everyone go to it. It's an incredible resource. But they actually have demonstrated that Muslims are voting more since the 2016 election. Voter registration numbers in 2016 were at 60% in the Muslim community. In 2017, they were at 68%, and in 2018, 75%. So you see this upward trend because people understand that voting makes a difference, and not just voting in the presidential elections, but voting in your local and statewide elections. When it comes to your school board representation, when it comes to making decisions about the environment, when it comes to local law enforcement, all of taxes, housing, infrastructure, all of those decisions are made at the local level. So if you are not voting, you do not have a voice in how those decisions are made and the people who will make those decisions. We know that for a fact. So voting matters. And I think American Muslims understand that and are registering and voting in record numbers. And I'll also say, Kamilah, American Muslims are running for election in a way that they never have.
That is true.
100 Muslims across the U.S. ran for some office. About half of them made it through their primaries. And there are a lot, Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, who will be the first Muslim woman in Congress, Ilhan Omar, Aisha Yaqub. There are many, Tahira Amatullah Wadud in Massachusetts. There are many Muslim women and men across the American Muslim community who are running because they understand that if they are not at the table, who is it that said if you're not on the table, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu?
So in that same vein then, I think that what I noticed when I was younger, and what I notice now is that there is a completely different line of thinking. I do agree that voting is important and it is one tool in the toolbox of civic engagement.
Absolutely.
I think that it's like maybe a righteous apathy, I would say, where people opt out of it. And I before I even say that, I will say that there is a difference between opting out of voting and then not being able to vote, right? Like, because that right has been taken away from you, or because you are disenfranchised in a way that does not allow you to vote. So those are two different conversations. Right. But I'm specifically talking about people who have the ability to vote and who do not face, a ton of obstacles that impede that right and still don't do it. I think that, some of the conversations that I've heard around that is like, well, it's not really changing anything. And, there are other things that we should be doing. And how does that, as Muslims or as Black Muslims specifically, how does that vibe with, a push for self-determination? And as a Muslim, if I'm voting in an election with two candidates that, I know are going to eventually do things that harm, people that look like me in different countries, then, how do I reconcile, my participation in that? And so even with we've had, like you said, a few Black Muslim elected officials in state and federal offices, and there are a lot more that are running. And I've noticed that, while their initial success is often touted, it's kind of short-lived. And then after that, very quickly, people start talking about authenticity. Like, are they Muslim enough? Are they Black enough? Are their politics helpful or harmful to the Black Muslim community? And if this is a person who is holding office in, a state that I don't live in, how do I keep that person accountable to my community or to the community that they are, representing if they're not necessarily relying on my vote? And so there is a lot more nuance besides people just not voting that I think it's important to acknowledge and kind of have that conversation, because, that was the conversation that my community in the West End of Atlanta was having, 20 years ago. And it may have changed more broadly, but that's still a conversation people are having.
Absolutely. This is a really important question. I'm glad that you brought it up, and I appreciate the way that you framed it so well. And, the thing about voting is, like you said, Kamilah, it's one of the tools in the toolbox. Voting is a gateway to expression and to representation. It is not the end all be all. You don't just get to show up at the polls and do nothing else, right? Like, that's where you begin, right? But just like you advocate for your family members and you advocate for yourself at work, when you place your dinner order, when you buy your clothing, you have to advocate for yourself about what type of housing you'll live on, what type of land you'll live on, where will your children go to school. And the reality is we know that particularly in America, our voter, the amount of people who vote is extraordinarily low for the quote unquote developed world. Something about half of eligible adults who can vote, registered voters, eligible to vote, who can vote, do vote. It makes no sense to me why the other half would say, well, it doesn't matter. Here in Georgia, we have 2 candidates running for governor. There are stark differences between the 2 of them. There are dramatically different positions on a lot of things, many of which are tied to your freedom to practice your religion. Mm-hmm. There is no way you can say that your vote does not count. And we are fighting to make sure that your vote does count. So I would just urge everyone to remember that it does matter. If you talk about self-determination and you want to pull on the legacy of Black power and you talk about self-determination, well, that means you have to be fully self-expressed. Voting is your self-expression. And it makes a difference when it talks about the laws that are in place in your community. And when you talk about county commissioners and how dollars are spent in your neighborhood, in your community, all of these things we know. So I would just urge anyone who is thinking along those lines to reevaluate the situation, to vote, and then get active.
Yeah, I think that where the conversation gets a little touchy is what you said when you talk about local issues. You know, and on the ballot here in Georgia, there are several propositions that, you know, directly impacts people now.
The environment, our education, our tax dollars,
criminal justice. There are all sorts of things.
These are tied to local elections. Right. If you know, in local elections, there may be several 100,000 people in a district. The local elections are usually less than 5,000 people vote.
Right.
So decisions, major, massive, precedent-setting decisions happen because 79 people voted one way as opposed to another way.
Right.
So if people were voting, it would make a difference and an impact. It's almost like you have this tyranny of the minority because only a handful of people came out to vote. And when you want to talk about those who have lost the right to vote or those who have been disenfranchised from voting, the states that you see that are now doing the work to ensure that every adult in that community be allowed to vote, they were voted into office so they can do that work, so that they can make sure that everyone can vote. But if you don't vote in leaders who believe in making sure that every vote counts and every vote matters, then yeah, it will continue to get worse, without a doubt.
I get it because I've seen it and I've seen the area of Atlanta where I live where, you know, certain areas are split into different states. You know, not states, cities, split into different cities, and, you know, where funding goes one place, and, you know, that means that the public school in that district that was serving the majority of the children no longer gets that funding. So I think that, but these aren't things that we necessarily know, right? Like someone has to explain that to you. There
are so many resources.
There are tons of resources,
and
but
we have to
really break that down to you on an individual level. And I think maybe that's where some of it is missing, because people focus on other types of engagement, or even it's like, I would like to see everybody come together, right? Like I would like to see the people who are just really like, you need to vote and you need to get out and vote, and this is really, really important, kind of find some way to engage with people who have decided that that is not their particular brand of engagement, and figure out where the breakdown is so that the two sides are at least coalescing enough to make some sort of movement, right? Because the thing is, the election is over tomorrow. And if the majority of people are completely disappointed by what happens, right? Then there's movement that has to be made after that. You know, you don't just cast a ballot and then leave, because
whatever happens,
if your person wins, you still need to hold them accountable, right?
Like whatever happens, we have to continue to engage. Absolutely. So first, I'm never going to say, don't vote, your vote doesn't matter, because we know for a fact that it does and that you should. So yes, vote. But like I said earlier, voting is a gateway. It's your entry. It's the least that you can do. You have many tools, many ways to engage. Use some of those other tools. I can't think, when you were talking, I was sitting here trying to think of an issue that wasn't somehow tied to local elections. I was thinking about my friends who are vegan and vegetarian, my friends who are doulas, my friends who are farmers, my friends who work with children in homeschool, my friends who work with people in hospice. All of these issues at some point go back to your local community. They go back to infrastructure, they go back to funding, being allowed to do it. All of these things are tied to voting. So I would say, just like, we in the Muslim community want to know more about our way of life, and we read Quran and we memorize Quran and we search when we have a question and we consult widely when we have a question, do the same for voter registration. Do the same for the issues in your community. There are so many resources easily accessible online. And as you said, many of the mosques for the past year have been running voter registration campaigns. Yeah. They've been breaking down the issues in simple language so that you can understand your ballot. I am a resource. You all know how to reach me. The Georgia Muslim Voter Project is a resource. There are so many ways that the ACLU of Georgia is a resource. There are so many ways that you can get the information that you need to engage. And truly, I have to be accountable, right? Like I can sit back and say, everything is rigged against me. There's no chance, there's no hope, but that would be doing a disservice to my ancestors. And it would be doing a disservice to me because Allah has given me free will and Allah has given me a mind to think and hands to work and time, talent, and resources to use in his service. So each of us, I believe, has that within them and is doing that work. And I would just encourage, I'm never going to say don't vote. So if that's what you're looking for from me, I can find out now.
I'm not looking for that. I am an advocate of conversation. Like I want people to be talking about these issues and to be thinking about them critically. And
what we need is for you to run. Like we need to see you on the school board. We need to see you as mayor, you as governor.
I'm pretty sure I don't have that type of clearance in my life. That's not the way.
You never know how you're gonna be called, sister.
I don't know if I'm set up for that particular thing. Just I don't have the clearance for that. But I will say this. I remember the first time that I went to vote. It wasn't because my Muslim community was talking about it, or it was even something encouraged. In fact, it was probably more discouraged than engaging in politics that type of way. But it was kind of like, my grandparents didn't care about that. They're not Muslim, and they were like, well, I mean, you're 18, so we vote in this family. This is what we do. And so I did. And since then, I have, thought more critically about how I engage in this process. But I know, like in Georgia, in Southern Georgia, you have, Black women our age and older who are humping to get people to the polls because, they literally need health care. Like they are like, we are going to die.
And Black women die.
Black women are dying. And yes, that they're dying. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the first point on is that is unique to the African American Muslim community. The idea that we have people in our family who may not be Muslim, but where the expectation has been set that you will vote, right? Because they remember what it was like, this year, 5 years, 50 years ago, when they tried to vote and it was taken away from them or it was suppressed and all the issues. So that is something that I think, African American Muslims have a unique sort of, it's in our DNA to register and to vote. And we need to just go on and do like we know we're supposed to do. The thing is, you're absolutely right. When you talk about rural Georgia, Black women die from breast cancer more than anybody else. maternal mortality. So women who give birth, Black women who give birth, who give birth to a child and then die is on the rise.
Yeah, it is.
In this country. It's on the rise. That is tied to access to healthcare, access to prenatal care, access to infant care. All of those things are tied to resources and they're tied to representation. In many rural parts of this country, you have to drive hours when you go into labor to have a baby. So I can't think of an issue that where you're voting for a particular candidate doesn't have an impact on your life, our life, your aunt's life, your father's life, your husband's life, your wife's life. It does have an impact. And these issues, quality of life issues impact African Americans disproportionately. So that's all the more reason. I think the sister Ayana, who is won in Massachusetts to win for Congress, said something along the lines of the people with the pain should have the most power in this process. So where's your power? If you won't even use the power you have, what are you doing?
Well, I think the last couple of days I've seen a lot about like voter shaming, and people, kind of talking down. It's very paternalistic the way people approach Black voters a lot of times. It's like, well, how dare you not do this? All these people died for you to do it. How dare you not do it? And that's kind of the end. And then the thing is like, okay, so first of all, people didn't die. Like they didn't just up and die. They were killed trying to do this. So that's a distinction that definitely needs to be made. But then the other thing is that there are people who engage in the other tools in that civic engagement toolbox, who organize and who are organizing beyond tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And I will just say once again that I would like all of these people to kind of talk and kind of come together and figure out how we use that entire toolbox for the benefit of our community and for, that, to me, that's what self-determination looks like. Using everything available, and everybody contributing what they can from whatever standpoint feels best for them,
right?
And whatever way they can be engaged.
Absolutely.
To do that, for the benefit of our larger community. So I think the last thing I want to talk about, since we did start talking about, Black women in Southern Georgia and, really being out there trying, for the simple reason of trying to expand Medicaid in our state, and really doing that. And so I think I want to talk a little bit about that lawsuit, the voter suppression, and what impact that has had on your organizing or, really how you feel about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's had a huge impact and it came up really quickly. So, Georgia is a state that has a long history of voter suppression.
Long.
And I think most people locally and around the country thought that we had resolved these things, that there were sufficient structures in place to make sure that every vote counted. But in fact, what we saw, in particularly what I'm noticing in this election cycle, is this chipping away of our rights. Mm-hmm. So we work on voter registration, and then after the voter registration, we work on getting out the vote, nonpartisan way completely. What we noticed in mid-October, so we're talking just a few weeks ago, is that absentee ballots, so absentee ballots are for people who are military or out of town or students studying abroad or people who can't get out of the home, they vote by absentee ballot.
Yeah.
So in mid-October, we were notified that an alarming number of applications for absentee ballots were rejected, and that an alarming number of actual ballots were rejected. So the applications, something like 563 statewide were rejected, and something like 187 of the absentee ballots were rejected. And they were rejected for this alleged signature mismatch, which means that someone, not a handwriting expert or any scientific technical expert in handwriting, would look at the application that came on the absentee ballot, and then they'd look at the file. And if they didn't think the two matched, they would reject the ballot and it would be thrown out and your vote would not count. Mm-hmm. So when we discovered that this was happening, we were all horrified. And as you can imagine, many of our constituents were really confused about whether their absentee ballots would count, whether their vote would count. And we immediately had to divert resources to retrain our team, and also to address the questions of our constituents who wanted to make sure that their vote counted, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the wrinkles that not a wrinkle, but the fact is, in Georgia, the Secretary of State who is in charge of voting is also running for office. He's running for governor. So he is a partisan candidate. He is responsible for voting statewide, and he is running for the highest office in this state. So there are all sorts of questions that many people in a nonpartisan way have brought up as this being a significant conflict. And the ACLU responded. The ACLU of Georgia represents us and two other plaintiffs, and we filed a lawsuit asking the judge to issue a temporary restraining order so that these absentee ballots were not rejected because of the mismatch, because there was no due process. It all came together in hours, like literally, I think between 24 and 72 hours, it all came together. The ACLU of Georgia came together, issued or filed the lawsuit on our behalf. And we had a hearing before Judge May. She asked a lot of questions. It was a lengthy and rigorous process, and she ruled in our favor. Mm-hmm. So immediately she issued guidance saying that there was a temporary restraining order on throwing out these ballots, but also putting in a process so that if there was an alleged mismatch, people still had a process by which they could go through to make sure that their vote counted.
Right.
It was a huge victory for voters across this state. The Secretary of State appealed and lost on appeal. So this impacted, there were 53,000 voters who were disenfranchised here in Georgia. So each organization is working their angle and their sort of their core competency to make sure that every voter in Georgia has the right to vote and their vote counts. This is extremely important work. I can't say how much I thank our executive director, Umair Rupani, who is on the ground in the field doing the actual work, and our counsel, Andrea Young and Sean Young at the ACLU of Georgia, for just being able to respond quickly and to provide expert guidance and really turn back. I mean, it was horrible to see these comments locally and nationally about all of the terrible things happening in Georgia where people their votes were being taken away. It was awful to be, I felt personally responsible and personally ashamed that my state would be a part of disenfranchising people. The greatest, that our democracy would actually be disenfranchising people who were disabled, people who, there's many reasons a match wouldn't be. If you look at my match from when I first signed up to vote, it's going to be different. If you break your arm, your signature is going to be different. If you had a stroke, your signature is going to be different. How could you ever take someone's right to vote away without due process? So I'm grateful that in this case, we were successful. I'm grateful for the leadership. And really, it was community organizers who alerted us, who provide the data, and who quickly funneled it up so that we had a chance to respond, because this was, literally weeks before the election.
All right. Well, congratulations. I know, I was watching with bated breath, and it definitely spurred me to check with all of my family members to make sure that everybody was on the up and up down here.
Well, and that's exactly it. Didn't we all call and say, wait, do you make sure? That's organizing. That's the snow chain. That's the snow tree, right? Like organizing to make sure. And, when it first happened to me, I was like, I got too much going on in my life. I've got this, I got that. I'm going overseas. I got, and I was like, wait a second. If I don't stop and participate and support this, what is it all for? What is it all for? So I'm grateful that you made those calls, sis, and I hope people continue to make calls and, don't be discouraged, because that was the other thing. I was like, we're going to do this and we're going to be opened up to hate and, all the sorts of terrible things that you see fall out online, and we're going to lose miserably in court. You know, that's what they prepared us for. They were like, there's a slim chance that we're going to win. That's what they said. So none of us were prepared to win, because the dynamic in Georgia is such that people do not expect to have the rights that we all have. They expect to be franchised. They expect to be told no. They expect to be denied. So I'm grateful that the Georgia Muslim Voter Project rallied, and we did it because we won. And we won on appeal.
Twice. So. Yes. So, I mean, I think for me that that was heartening, because it did what I said I wanted to see. So it had, there was the legal challenge, right? But then there were also people just on the ground alerting people.
Right. And it was a coalition. There was a woman who took the suit, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, who is the group that we work very closely with. They became on as a plaintiff. So this organizing work is coalition work. This is coalition work.
Absolutely.
It makes a difference.
Well, thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you for this conversation. I just want, the struggle for liberation and voting are not necessarily the same thing. We know better than any other people, well, not in every other, but we know as a people that what is legal is not always just, and that, that looking for justice in our legal system is not always what we want it to be, but that there is work to be done. And that is that our vote is a way to do that. In the midst of gerrymandering, in the midst of voter suppression, in the midst of disenfranchisement, for those of us who still retain that and can exercise it, it is a tool to be used in conjunction with organizing on the ground level around very specific issues. So I appreciate your work.
My pleasure.
For what you and the Georgia Muslim Voter Project are doing, and your, allied organizations across the country. And to everybody who watches this, I hope you choose to engage in some sort of way. By tomorrow and beyond, Wednesday, we got to wake up. We don't know what's going to happen, but the struggle continues. So I'll be doing my part.
Inshallah, we'll all do our part. Thank you so much, Kamilah. I really appreciate this time. And if there's anyone, I encourage people to look us up, the Georgia Muslim Voter Project. It's GAMVP.org. If we can ever be helpful to you, please let us know. We're happy to do it. And vote tomorrow. Vote.
Engage, people. You heard her. All right. Thank you, Saleemah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.